Hello, I'm Rob Sweeney, and I'm the author of You're Not Just a Diagnosis, Using Trauma-Informed Techniques to Create Your Best Life. Now let's talk for a minute about the difference between having a traumatic experience and having a bad experience. In both cases, it's an uncomfortable concept. It's uncomfortable having trauma, and it's uncomfortable having bad experiences. But what's the difference? The difference is what it means to the person who's having that experience, which is why two people having the same experiences side by side will have different outcomes. You will have a person sitting right next to a person who was horribly traumatized by what happened, and the one sitting there didn't feel it at all, and he's wondering why that other person took it so hard. Trauma is a bad experience that changes both our definition of the world around us, the ability to understand the world around us, whether it's a good place or a bad place, and whether it makes sense to me, and also how that person fits in the world after the experience, whether they are a good person or a bad person, an important person, a weak person, someone in control, someone with no power. All of those parts of the definition of how you fit in the world are changed by the traumatic experience. A bad experience doesn't change who we are. It's simply a bad experience, and everybody has bad experiences. So it's not necessarily going to change who we are or the world. We can expect it to happen, and it happens. It's that difference between what the world is that's changed, who I am that's changed, and whether it has or not. We can see this in World War I experiences when we first started to define what eventually became known as post-traumatic stress disorder, when we see privates and officers in the same trench being hit by the same shells fired from the same cannons at the same time. Remember, in World War I, we had created for the first time the idea of industrial death. They had invented cannons that could literally hit a person 27 miles away. And this was during the Industrial Revolution, when privates were recruited from factories where they had been working basically as a cog in the machine. And officers were recruited from a level of middle class or nobility, people whose ancestors had been soldiers, professional soldiers, literally for generations. Those officers' families and ancestors and friends and peers had all been taught that the way you fight a war was to climb on a horse, grab your sword, ride to the other end of the field, beat the person up, take their stuff, you win. The guy from the factory had learned that what you do is you turn a crank until you stop. You go home and eventually you get paid if you do that for enough days. Now they're sitting together in a trench, and a cannon 27 miles away is bombing them. For the person behind the cannon, who's in the trench is meaningless. Why they're there is meaningless. Whether or not there's a trench is meaningless. All he knows is where to point the cannon and when to fire it. 27 miles away, down in that hole, the two men, one from a factory and one from a family of officers, have entirely different beliefs of what's going to happen in the world. The man from the factory sort of expects the world could be a pretty terrible place and things happen that are outside your control. And war is fought, as far as he understands, sort of like a machine. You do what you're told, you're a cog in the machine. Some of us will survive, some of us get to go home. For the officer, that moment of glory, that opportunity to show who you are, to demonstrate that your past makes a difference, is all stripped away by the fact he sits in a trench and waits to be bombed. And when the bomb hits, the officer's world is completely gone. And his place in it has been completely wiped away. And what we find is those soldiers coming back from World War I, more officers had what we would call PTSD than enlisted soldiers, because their world changed and their concept of themselves changed. This happens when trauma with people every day, all around the world, to varying levels, depending on what they're experiencing, what they expected, what their concept of themselves has been, what their concept of the world has been. And that's where we start when we try to help people treat trauma.